They were told to expect guns, chains, and punishment. The American soldiers wore hats like in the movies, wide-brimmed, dust-streaked, cocked at angles that made them seem like something out of a dream or a nightmare. "Line up, girls," one of them barked. The women froze. They were comfort girls, forced into brothels by the Japanese Imperial Army. Now, prisoners of war, they had been captured by advancing U.S. forces in the Philippines. Many were barefoot, sick, barely more than shadows. They had no names, only numbers. They were prepared for ridicule, retaliation, even death. Instead, the cowboys brought blankets. They passed out steaming soup, bandages, toothbrushes. One held up a bar of chocolate, raising it like an offering. Another removed his hat and bowed to the woman in front of him. The women didn't move, couldn't. The script they'd been forced to live was unraveling in real time. The world they thought they knew had just flipped on its head. And this was only the beginning. For a long moment, no one moved. Dust curled in the still air. A cicada buzzed somewhere in the brush, a harsh, rattling sound that felt too loud for what was happening. The women stood shoulder to shoulder in torn kimonos and threadbare blouses, sunburned faces blank with exhaustion. Most looked at the ground. Some didn't look at all, their eyes lost somewhere behind memory. When the cowboy said, "Line up, girls," the phrase echoed like a slap. It was said casually, without venom. But still, it was a command, and every command in their lives had been followed by pain. They lined up. There were about 20 of them, though none were sure anymore. Some had come from Korea, others from Manchuria or the Philippines. Each had been promised work, then trapped, then dragged into something with no name. Officially, they were comfort women. Unofficially, they were ghosts who still walked. Some were barely teenagers, a few older. None had real ages anymore, only time measured in ache. The men they faced looked impossibly clean. Dusty boots, yes, but uniforms without rot or blood. Wide hats that shaded their eyes, some with bandanas tied at the neck. American soldiers, but not like the ones they had been warned about. These ones leaned on rifles like fence posts. One held a canteen loosely in his hand. Another had a cigarette tucked behind his ear. They looked like characters from the reels the girls had been forced to watch before the war, grinning devils with fire in their fists. But no fire came. Instead, the man with the cigarette stepped forward and dropped something on the ground. A rolled blanket, folded tight. Next to it, a small paper packet, salt crackers, maybe. He didn't speak. He just nodded once, then stepped back. The women stared at the offering like it might detonate. Hannah stood near the end of the line. Her dress hung off her shoulders, too large after months of shrinking. She was 17, maybe 18. She didn't know any more. What she did know was this: men who wore uniforms didn't give gifts. They took things. They shouted, grabbed, kicked, and left. That was the shape of the world. And now here stood a cowboy, placing food at her feet like she was something alive. She looked up. It was only for a second, a glance, unguarded, dangerous. But in that second, the man saw her, not as a prisoner, not as a number, but as someone. He didn't smile, he didn't wink or speak. He just met her gaze, then shifted his eyes away, respectfully, as if he knew she'd been seen too much already. That moment split something inside her. Beside her, another girl wept, not loudly, just soft, silent tears tracking down a dirt-smudged cheek. She was whispering something, again and again. Hannah leaned closer. The word was trap, over and over like a prayer. This must be a trick, they all thought. Surely after the blankets would come the ropes, after the bread, the bayonets. It had to be, but it didn't come. The Americans brought more supplies, water, tin cups, gauze. One even offered a cigarette, then took a puff to show it wasn't poisoned. No one took it. Not yet. Trust was a currency no one had left to spend. When night fell, the soldiers set up tents nearby, but not too close. There was no laughter, no music, only the soft murmur of foreign voices and the smell of something cooking that wasn't rice or rot. Hannah sat with her knees pulled to her chest, wrapped in the blanket the cowboy had left. It scratched her skin, but it was dry. It was hers. She glanced once more toward the men by the fire and found herself wondering the most dangerous question of all. What if they're not like them? She didn't dare say it aloud, but she dared to look. But before she had that thought, before the blanket, the bread, the cowboy's gaze, there had been nothing but silence. And before the silence, there had been screaming. The comfort station in Luzon was a crumbling building wrapped in wire and humidity. Once it might have been a schoolhouse or a storage depot. Now it was a cage with walls painted in lies. The sign outside read medical quarters. Inside there were no doctors, only rows of mats, buckets for waste, and a ledger kept by a Japanese officer who never once looked any of them in the eye. The word comfort was a cruelty so sharp it barely registered anymore. Each girl had a number. That was all. Hannah's was 83. It had been written in ink on the inside of her left arm, then overwritten again with a new mark when she was transferred. Paper records could be burned. Flesh could not. There were rules. Wake at sunrise. Scrub the floors. Stand in the doorway when summoned. Always bow. Always smile. A guard once broke a girl's arm for failing to greet a customer with enough enthusiasm. The girl had smiled too late. That was her crime. Hannah never smiled late. She didn't smile at all. She remembered the night she was taken. She had been 16, hanging laundry in the dusk behind her family's small home on the outskirts of Busan. The sky was the color of eggplant, and her little brother was chasing a frog through the grass. The truck came with no warning, just the slam of doors and the bark of orders. Her mother screamed once. That was the last sound Hannah remembered. The journey south blurred into days. She was shoved into a train car with 12 other girls. One tried to throw herself off the moving train and was shot in the back before she hit the ground. They didn't stop the train. When they arrived in Luzon, the Japanese soldiers handed them to men who looked like clerks, pale, neat, notebooks always in hand. One by one the girls were processed. Their names were not asked. Their blood type was. So was whether they were still pure. That determined what room they were sent to. Hannah never found out what her answer meant. Only that her first night came with pain so blinding she forgot her own voice. From that day forward, silence became her armor. She had learned quickly not to speak, not to cry, not to remember. One girl from Jeju Island had once tried to fight. She scratched a guard's face. They made the rest of them watch what happened next. After that, no one fought. The comfort station was a system designed not only to break bodies, but to erase the idea of resistance. Shame was part of the design. They were told again and again, "You are traitors, you are filthy, you serve the emperor now." The walls of the building echoed with these words. Hannah stopped hearing them after a while. Not because they stopped, but because she buried them so deep that only dreams could dig them up. Some of the women forgot their own languages. Others forgot their names. One girl called herself 37, long after they'd stopped using numbers. Another simply stopped speaking altogether. And still, they survived. When the shelling began in the distance, American artillery pushing closer, Hannah thought it would be the end. They were told to prepare for evacuation, but no trucks came. No one came. The guards vanished in the night like rats leaving a ship. That was when the cowboy arrived, when the blanket touched her skin, when the world she thought she knew began to crumble like the plaster on those station walls. But before all of that, she had learned one truth above all: silence was survival. And now, something even more dangerous was beginning to take its place. A different truth, one she hadn't dared believe since the night the sky turned to smoke. That maybe, just maybe, there was still something left inside her worth saving. The first American voices came at dawn, low, clipped commands in English, echoing off the tree line like distant thunder. Some women screamed, others dropped to the ground. A few ran. One bolted barefoot into the brush and didn't get far, her body too weak, her lungs collapsing with every step. Hannah didn't run. She simply closed her eyes and waited for the gunshot. It never came. The boots arrived first, heavy, deliberate. Then the strange rhythm of words she didn't understand. Then silence. When Hannah finally opened her eyes, there was a man standing over her, not with a weapon raised, but with both hands up, empty. He said something, slow and measured. His voice wasn't angry, it sounded concerned. The man wasn't Japanese. His skin was pale, but tanned by sun. His uniform looked like something out of a movie. He wore no helmet, only a soft-brimmed hat that shaded his brow. He looked down at her, not with triumph or disgust, but like someone looking at a wounded animal, unsure if it would let him close. Hannah blinked. He crouched, gently, lowering himself to her level. From the pocket of his jacket he pulled a small rectangle wrapped in paper. He held it out with 2 fingers. Chocolate. Hannah stared at it, her stomach twisted, unsure if the pain was hunger or nausea or both. The man waited, didn't push, just held it out, like an offering. The first time she had heard the word American, it was whispered in the back corridors of the comfort station, spoken like a curse. The Americans, the guards had said, were monsters. They would kill you slowly, tear out your fingernails, burn your skin with their strange machines. Better to die by Japanese hands than to fall into theirs. That was the gospel of the Empire. Now, here was one of those monsters, kneeling before her with a bar of chocolate and a look on his face that didn't match anything she'd ever been taught to expect. She didn't take the candy, but she didn't flinch either. That, in itself, felt like betrayal. Around her, the other women were rising slowly, blinking, coughing, some sobbing without sound. The Americans didn't touch them. They didn't bark orders. They didn't laugh. Instead, they moved methodically, checking wounds, offering canteens of water, pointing toward the shade where stretchers had been laid out beneath canvas tarps. One woman collapsed at the feet of a medic. He didn't react with panic or revulsion. He dropped to his knees and began wrapping her foot in gauze, his hands gentle, practiced. She cried out once, more in confusion than pain. The world was upside down. The propaganda had been wrong, but not just wrong. It had been something worse. It had been empty. All those promises of death, dishonor, unspeakable cruelty. Instead, these men handed out blankets. One tried to speak in broken Japanese. No, hurt, you, safe now. The words didn't matter. The tone did. Later, as the women sat in the back of an open truck, the sun, high overhead, Hannah saw the soldier again, the one with the chocolate. He was standing near a tree, wiping his face with a cloth. She looked at him. He looked back, and then he bowed. Not a deep, mocking bow, not the stiff posture of military rank, just a simple incline of the head, a gesture of respect. Hannah felt her throat tighten. She didn't know in that moment whether to cry or scream, because that small bow did something she wasn't prepared for. It acknowledged her existence, not as property, not as a number, but as a human being. That, more than any kindness, undid her, because the enemy was not supposed to kneel, and yet he had. Inside the American Field Hospital, the air smelled of bleach, broth, and something almost magical, clean linen. The scent hit Hannah like a memory she hadn't known was missing. The floor was wooden, not concrete. There were no chains, no shouting, just soft footsteps and the occasional rattle of enamel bowls. She sat on a cot with her knees tucked up, arms wrapped around her ribs, the coarse blanket folded in her lap. She hadn't dared lie down yet. Not because she wasn't tired, but because she didn't know if it was allowed. The nurse approached quietly, crouching low. She had hair the color of corn, tied back in a braid, and eyes not unlike Hannah's mother's, faint lines around them, as if she smiled too often. In her hands was a tray, bread, soup, something white and lumpy that steamed. Hannah stared at it. The nurse set it down and said something gentle, something Hannah didn't understand. Then, slowly, she reached forward, not to grab, not to command, but to brush Hannah's hair from her face. It was that gesture that undid her. The soup was hot, thick with potato and carrot. The bread was soft and warm in the center. When Hannah lifted the spoon to her lips, the taste struck her so sharply she nearly dropped it. It wasn't just food, it was care. Across the room, another girl took her first bite and dropped her spoon. Her shoulders shook. Her fingers clutched the edge of the tray. She wasn't choking, she was weeping. Bread had made her cry. No one mocked her. The nurse didn't react with surprise. She knelt, placed a hand lightly on the girl's back, and waited until the sobs passed. Another soldier brought over a cup of water and set it down with a quiet nod. There were no commands, no punishments for tears, no shame in being weak. The room held too much gentleness. It was overwhelming. One girl whispered, "It's a trick," under her breath. Another refused to eat, certain the food was poisoned, but most gave in, not because they believed, but because their bodies overruled their fear. After the meal, Hannah was shown to a smaller tent behind the main building. Inside were rows of cots, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, and a blanket folded with military precision. There was no lock on the flap, no guards pacing, just the sound of wind against canvas. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, gripping the blanket in her hands. It was olive drab, coarse wool, but it was clean. It smelled faintly of soap and starch. She pressed it to her face and closed her eyes. She hadn't had a bed since the night she was taken. For nearly 2 years she had slept on mats, on floors, on dirt. This was foreign, not just physically, but philosophically. A bed suggested comfort, rest, that someone believed her sleep mattered. She lay down slowly, as if the cot might vanish. The mattress gave slightly beneath her weight, and the pillow cradled her head with such tenderness she flinched. Her body didn't know what to do. It stayed tense, coiled for impact. But there was none. Above her, the ceiling of the tent rippled in the breeze. The light filtered through like late afternoon in spring. Hannah exhaled. The war had not ended. The fences were still there, the uniforms still foreign. But something had shifted, because in this place, in this bed, wrapped in a stranger's blanket, fed by the hands of an enemy, she felt the most dangerous thing of all, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, she mattered. But belief was not the same as safety. At night, the camp breathed with a different rhythm. There were no boots stomping past the tents, no shouted orders slicing the air. The guards walked softly, their voices low. Somewhere a harmonica played a slow, wandering tune, lonely, almost hesitant, like even the music wasn't sure it was allowed to exist here. Hannah lay awake, listening. Her body rested, but her mind would not. The blanket was warm. The cot didn't bite. But her thoughts did. In the bunk beside her, someone whispered, "They're softening us. You know that, right?" Another voice answered, tight and ragged, "So we won't scream when they start." No one argued, because deep down, fear was still stronger than food. Trust was not built in days, not after what they had lived through, not after the years of being told that the world was only pain and that kindness was just camouflage. One girl still refused to eat. She took the bread each morning and tore it into small pieces, stuffing them under her mattress, hoarding it just in case. Another wept after every bath, as if washing off the past made it more real. Hannah understood them. She had not spoken since arriving, not a word. The nurses thought she was mute. She let them believe it. Speaking still felt like risk. Her voice had always brought danger, either through screams she wasn't allowed to make or truths she was forbidden to say. But silence did not keep her from thinking. They were told they could write letters. A young interpreter explained it carefully, his Korean stilted but sincere. "We want your family to know. You can write. Say you are alive." Paper was handed out. So were pencils. Hannah took hers with trembling fingers. She stared at the blank page for an hour. What was she supposed to write? That she was sleeping on a real bed, while her mother, if she still lived, likely slept on a floor with the roof missing. That American doctors had touched her gently while her own country had thrown her away. That she had eaten meat, real meat, for the first time in over a year. She didn't write any of that. Instead, she wrote, "I am alive. I am fed. I am treated with care. I do not understand." She folded the letter and handed it back without meeting anyone's eyes. That night, someone laughed. It happened suddenly. A clumsy American guard tripped over a stool outside the barracks and cursed loudly in English. The sound was so sharp, so unexpected, that one of the women let out a small snort. Then another giggled, and just like that, for the first time in years, the sound of laughter rolled through the tent. It didn't last long. The women quickly fell silent, some clapping hands over their mouths as if they'd broken a sacred rule. One girl whispered, panicked, "Stop, they'll hear." But no punishment came. The guard outside only muttered something, then walked on. Inside, Hannah sat up slowly. She looked around the darkened room where women now lay, wide-eyed in their beds, stunned by what had just escaped them. Laughter. It was the most terrifying thing they'd done, because it meant something no one dared say aloud, that this place might not be a trick, that the nightmare might be over. And if that was true, what did it mean about the life they'd left behind? It wasn't until the third week that Hannah saw herself. She had gone to the infirmary for a cough. Nothing serious, just dust and cold air mixing in her lungs. The nurse, quiet, kind, always humming, took her temperature, listened to her chest, and offered a small bottle of syrup. Then, as Hannah stood to leave, the nurse motioned her toward a side room. "Clean yourself up," she said gently, gesturing to a small metal basin and a stack of towels. "There's a mirror. You can use it." Hannah hesitated. Mirror. The word struck something buried deep. She stepped inside. The curtain fell closed behind her, and for a moment the room was still. There, nailed to the wall above the wash basin, was a small square of glass. Cracked in the corner, streaked with time, but still a mirror. She moved slowly toward it, as if the image inside might lash out. And there she saw her. The girl in the glass was gaunt, her cheeks hollow. Her hair was matted at the ends, uneven from where she'd cut it with a dull blade nearly a year ago. Her lips were chapped, her eyes too wide, too old, but they were her eyes. She stared for a long time, heart racing. She had forgotten this face, not just its features, but the fact that it had ever belonged to her. In the station there were no mirrors, no reflective surfaces, no moments allowed for vanity or self-recognition. It had been intentional, a kind of erasure. When you couldn't see yourself, you couldn't remember who you were. Now, here she was. Behind her the curtain rustled. A man's voice, soft, apologetic, called out, "Miss Hannah?" She turned. It was the American doctor. Older, spectacled, his uniform half unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up. He held something small in his hands. "These are for you," he said. She didn't understand. He stepped inside and opened the case. Inside, a pair of eyeglasses. "Prescription," he said, tapping his own lenses. "No one should live in a blur." He placed them gently in her hands, then stepped back, letting her decide. She hadn't worn glasses since she was a child. They'd been taken from her the night she was captured. For years the world had been fogged at the edges. Faces were guesses. Books were blurs. She had grown used to the blur. She put them on. The world sharpened. The first thing she noticed was the stitching on the doctor's sleeve, tight, methodical, perfectly spaced. Then the way the sunlight struck the chipped corner of the mirror. Then, most shocking of all, her own reflection again, but clearer. She gasped. The doctor said nothing. He simply nodded, then left her there. No demand for thanks, no questions, just a gesture given freely. She turned back to the mirror. The face had not changed, still thin, still tired. But the clarity changed everything. Now she saw the faint scar above her eyebrow, the dust in her eyelashes, the way her mouth curved slightly to one side, details she had forgotten or never known. It was like meeting herself again after a long, brutal exile. In the hallway, someone laughed, not cruelly, just laughter, alive and unafraid. Hannah touched the edge of the mirror and whispered something, just one word. In Korean, a name, hers. And for the first time in a long time, she said it not as a memory, but as a truth. She was here. She could see. Clarity did not come all at once. It came in pieces, small, almost invisible shifts that accumulated like dust in sunlight. The next shift arrived in the form of a canvas bag placed on each cot one morning. Hannah woke to the sound of quiet footsteps and saw the item lying near her feet. A sewing kit, needles, thread, small scissors, a thimble. Nothing dangerous, nothing remarkable. And yet, to the women in the barracks, it felt like something forbidden. No orders came with it, no instructions. The Americans simply left the kits there, as though assuming the women would know what to do. Hannah picked up the needle. Her hands trembled. She had not sewn anything since she'd patched her brother's shirt on the night before she was taken, thread pulling through cotton while her mother sang a low lullaby in the kitchen. She had forgotten the feeling of mending, of taking something torn and making it whole again. Beside her, another girl stared at the kit as though it were a trap. "Why would they give us this?" she whispered. Someone answered softly, "So we can work." But this wasn't forced labor. There was no overseer watching, no punishment looming. The sewing was voluntary, a suggestion, not a command. It was, for the first time in years, a choice. A choice was a dangerous thing. Hannah threaded the needle slowly, the thin thread slipping between her fingers. She lifted a torn hem from her own dress and began to stitch. The needle dipped in and out. The fabric drew closer. A line took shape. Something broken mended. And with each stitch, something inside her, a small, rigid thing, loosened. Worth. That was what the act whispered. Worth not as an object, but as a person capable of repair. The Americans noticed. One soldier, the young one with sandy hair, paused at the doorway and watched the women sewing. His gaze did not linger in hunger or pity. He looked at them like workers, creators, people doing something useful. When he nodded at Hannah's neat stitches, she felt heat rise to her cheeks. Not shame. Something else. Something frightening in its unfamiliarity. Later that week, another gift arrived. Seeds. Small paper packets, each labeled with drawings of vegetables or flowers. The cowboy from the first day walked down the row, handing them out one by one. When he reached Hannah, he tapped the packet lightly. "Plant," he said, shaping the word clearly, slowly. Then, pointing to the open patch of land beside the barracks, he added, "Grow, grow." The word hit deeper than she expected. The Japanese had never asked them to grow anything except obedience. Their lives had been stripped to survival, no futures, no plans, no space to imagine anything beyond the next hour. But growth implied time, care, continuity, a kind of future. The women hesitated at first. The soil was dry, the sun unforgiving. They weren't sure plants could live here, let alone something as fragile as hope. But the soldiers brought buckets of water, tools, gloves. They didn't force the women to help. They simply waited. Hannah knelt in the dirt. She pressed her fingers into the earth, feeling its warmth. It had been years since she'd touched soil without fear, without the weight of footsteps behind her. She dug a small hole, placed the seeds inside, and covered them gently. A girl beside her whispered, "Why bother? We won't be here long." Another murmured, "Maybe the plants will." By dusk, a row of small dark mounds lined the edge of the clearing. They looked insignificant, almost foolish. But when the Americans saw them, their faces softened with something like pride. That night, as the wind rustled the canvas walls, Hannah lay awake thinking about the seeds buried in the earth. They were unseen, unproven, fragile, and yet they held the possibility of becoming something entirely different. She wondered if she did too. And then one night she dreamed of a house that didn't exist. Not the old one in Busan, with its low roof and smoky hearth, but something different, a place she'd never seen, built from memory and invention. It had windows that opened wide, and in the back, a garden. Her garden. She woke with tears on her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from something even stranger, longing. But with that longing came guilt. Letters had begun arriving, one every few days, typed and translated by military clerks, passed into the hands of women who read them like they might turn to ash. Hannah's came from a cousin, someone she hadn't seen since the occupation began. It was short and careful. Her mother had survived. Her father had not. The village had been burned. Food was scarce. People were starving. And here she was, fed, clothed, safe. The shame was immediate and all-consuming. She folded the letter neatly, pressed it against her chest, and wept in silence, while others slept. In the comfort station, survival had been the only goal. There was no time for reflection, no space for guilt. Now, with each small comfort, came the unbearable weight of knowing others had none. One afternoon, as she watered the edge of the garden where tiny green shoots had begun to sprout, a younger girl asked her a question. "Are we still Japanese?" It was whispered so softly it could have been mistaken for the breeze. Hannah didn't answer right away. The question wasn't about nationality. It was about identity, about belonging, about whether the girls in this camp, once comfort women for an empire that had consumed them, still had any place in that empire now that they were no longer useful. And beneath that question was a deeper one. If the Americans were kind, what did that make the Japanese who had used them? The answers didn't come, but the question itself hung in the air for days, unspoken yet felt by all. Some girls clung to old loyalties, others began to unravel. Hana, in her own quiet way, chose a third path. She found a stub of chalk in one of the supply crates, and after dinner she crouched beside a flat section of wall near the infirmary. She wrote a letter, A, then another, then a Korean character beside it. The next evening, 2 girls joined her. By the end of the week, there were 5. They practiced writing their names, the names their mothers gave them. Some had forgotten how. Hana helped them remember. She never announced it, never claimed leadership. It wasn't a classroom. It was survival by other means. Not the survival of bodies, but of self. And every time someone traced a letter in chalk, every time a name re-emerged from the fog, it was a tiny act of rebellion against the silence that had once been their only language. A soldier passed one night and paused to watch. He said nothing, just tipped his hat, smiled, and walked on. That smile said, "We see you." And for women who had once been told they were invisible, that was everything. If you're enjoying this story so far, please like the video and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? But not everyone wanted to see. The war ended on a quiet morning that did not feel any different from the one before it. There were no sirens, no fireworks, no shouts of triumph. Only a rumor drifting from tent to tent, a hush that rolled through the camp like a breeze carrying the scent of change. Hours later, a tired voice reading from a radio confirmed what none of them dared believe. Japan had surrendered. The emperor had spoken. For a long time, no one moved. Some girls wept, some laughed with disbelief, and others simply stared at their hands, unsure what it meant to be freed from a life that had already been stolen. When the announcement came, repatriation, many didn't even react. Home felt like a memory blurred by smoke. The voyage back to the Korean peninsula was slow and wind-beaten. Hana stood at the railing of the ship as it cut through restless waves, the spray gathering on her cheeks like cold tears. She thought of her mother's hands, her father's quiet voice, the narrow lanes of her village. She also thought of the station, the soldiers, the blankets, the seeds she never planted. She felt suspended between 2 worlds, one that had broken her, another that had begun to piece her back together. And now she was being returned to a place she no longer recognized as her own. By the time the ship docked in Busan, her legs trembled not from fear, but from uncertainty so deep it hollowed her out. There was no welcome party at the pier, no family calling her name. The dock swarmed with the wounded and the wandering, orphans clutching empty bowls, men missing limbs, mothers searching faces that were not the ones they had prayed to find. Hana stepped off the gangway alone, her satchel pressed tightly to her chest. Inside were the only belongings she had: the glasses the American doctor fitted for her, a translated letter from her cousin, and a brittle packet of seeds she had carried across an ocean, even though she knew they would never grow again. She walked through streets that bore the scars of fire and shelling. Homes were charred bones. Markets were little more than broken stalls. This was Busan, but not the one she had last seen as a girl. It was a place remade by war, and she was a stranger in it. A local women's shelter took her in without asking her name. They gave her a blanket, a corner to sleep in, and a bowl of thin rice porridge. When they quietly learned where she had been, a subtle shift passed through the room. their eyes softened with pity and hardened with something else. Resignation, perhaps, or recognition. No one said the words, "comfort woman." In Korea, such words lived in shadows. They belonged to shame, not speech. Women like Hana were ghosts of a story no one wanted to hear. Men avoided her gaze. Some older villagers crossed themselves when she walked by, as if her presence might bring misfortune. She became invisible in a way she had not expected, not erased by force, but by silence. At the shelter, she met others like her. They sat on the floor in the evenings, peeling vegetables or mending donated clothes. They did not trade stories. Trauma had its own language, and each woman understood it instinctively without needing words. Hana worked in the kitchen, cleaned where she was asked, and kept her head low. But at night, when the shelter fell quiet, she slipped outside and traced Korean characters in the dirt, reclaiming bits of herself letter by letter. She never wrote about the Americans, nor the blankets, nor the garden, nor the bow of the soldier who treated her as human. Those memories didn't fit the narrative expected of her, nor the shame she was supposed to carry. They were hers alone, fragile, complicated, impossible to explain. She thought often of the seeds in her satchel, crushed and lifeless. She wondered if the ones she had planted in that distant clearing had lived long enough to sprout. Perhaps a soldier had watered them. Perhaps they bloomed and someone paused to admire something small and green in a place once filled with despair. Maybe their existence, however brief, meant something. Maybe hers did too. But for now, she remained silent. Speaking required someone willing to listen, and Korea was not yet ready to hear the truth of women like her. Some battles ended with treaties, others ended with rubble, and some, like hers, became stories waiting for the right moment to be told. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself in uneven lines, new buildings rising beside craters, new borders drawn over old wounds. Hana worked where she could, washing dishes in a tea house, sewing hems for neighborhood wives, tending a small rooftop garden in the city where she eventually settled. People who met her saw only a quiet woman with steady hands and distant eyes. No one asked why she flinched at loud footsteps. No one questioned why she always slept lightly, waking at the faintest sound. Silence is an armor that grows heavier with time, but it is armor all the same. She kept a small wooden box under her bed, nothing ornate, nothing that would make anyone wonder. Inside lay only one thing, a bar of American soap. Its edges were cracked, corners worn down into uneven curves. The faint scent, something like pine, something like home and foreignness mixed together, had faded over the years, but Hana could still smell it when she pressed it to her cheek. It was the bar they handed her in the field hospital, the one she used in that first shower, when months of filth had slid off her skin, and, for a moment, she remembered what it felt like to be touched only by water, not by violence. She kept it because it was proof. Proof that there had been a moment when she was treated as human. Proof that even in captivity, someone had seen her, not as property, not as shame, not as a wound, but as a girl who deserved clean skin and warm food and the simple dignity of rest. That moment was more dangerous than any weapon ever pointed at her, because it had cracked open the narrative she had been forced to live inside. And once the crack had opened, nothing could erase it again. Memory has a way of resisting even when a person cannot. Each time Hana opened the box, she felt the resistance pulse softly beneath her ribs. She remembered the cowboy bowing his head, the doctor fitting her glasses, the nurse brushing hair from her face, the girls planting seeds in stubborn soil, the laughter that escaped in the dark like something feral finally freed. These were not grand gestures. None would appear in history books. but they lodged themselves deep in a place no shame could fully erase. Small gestures leave the deepest scars, the cruel ones carve wounds that never close. But the kind ones, those unexpected, quiet mercies, leave marks too. Marks that do not hurt but ache, reminding the body of a truth it does not always know how to hold, that even after being broken, a person can still be seen, still be cared for, still matter. For Hannah, the soap became the anchor of that truth. When life felt bleak, when neighbors whispered, when the old trauma rose like smoke in her lungs, she opened the box and held the bar in her hands. It reminded her of the dangerous idea that had once taken root in an American camp far from home. The idea that life might still be worth living, that she might still be more than what had been done to her. She never married. She rarely spoke of the war. But she tended her rooftop garden faithfully, coaxing green from dust, believing in growth even when the world had taught her not to. And every so often, when a flower bloomed where none had been expected, she felt that same quiet shock she had felt when a stranger in a wide-brimmed hat had knelt down and looked at her as if she were simply human. Memory did not free her from pain, but it kept her from disappearing inside it. If you were moved by Hannah's journey, please give this video a like and drop a comment below, telling us where in the world you're watching from. Let's make sure her story, and others like hers, are never forgotten.